Hello everybody and welcome to Handmade Hero Show, where we code a complete game live on stream. We are going to do, I guess, honestly what it is really is skeletal animation is what we're doing today. We don't have a need for the deformation stuff that you might do in a normal skeletal animation system because we don't have 3D objects. We don't even really have any bone binding information for our 2D objects per se. But even so, we do kind of want to animate them as if they did, meaning we want like a bunch of secondary stuff. So when our characters hop around, we want the heads to be kind of springy. And we implemented some of that stuff before. But the way that we did it was in a fairly rudimentary sense where you couldn't really build up any kind of skeleton a priori and give it information that would then look to the art to see how it should be connected. And so what we want to do today, and we set ourselves up to do this yesterday, but we didn't actually have time to go and start working on the code for the actual sort of skeletal part of it, is we want to go in and add that ability, because now we have a little editor in the game that allows us to like mark up our stuff with points that say how things snap together. That's basically what a skeletal animation system does offline usually. So for example, if someone inside Maya creates a little bone structure, that bone structure is typically exported, and then you load it into your game, and those bones tell you the information that we would want inside Handmade Hero, which is how does each piece connect and where do they connect, right? But we don't have that information because our stuff just comes in as sprites. And that's intentional because we don't really want to insert tools into the art chain that are complicated, because this is supposed to be an educational project, and we want people to be able to add to it easily. So if they just can draw a bitmap in a bitmap tool, we want them to be able to put that into this game eventually, right? If people are playing with it themselves. We don't want them to have to learn something like Maya. We don't want them to have to learn something like Spriter. If they can just use like Photoshop, we want them to be able to get stuff into the game. But what that means is there's no markup in there, right? There's nothing that says how heads connect to bodies. And inside our code, we could special case every last little thing and just describe all of that in code. But if we did that, then people who add new heads, new bodies, new whatever, couldn't really ever change the basics of how they worked. They couldn't have heads that attached like lower on the body or something for someone who was hunched over or whatever, right? They couldn't have bodies that had a long skinny neck and put the head up at the top instead. If we hard code all of those ideas about how things are attached directly into the code, it becomes much more limiting in terms of what you can do when you put art into the game and want to implement new entities that maybe don't look exactly like the old entities that were already programmed by me. So that's the goal. And we did a lot of work to make that happen. We have the ability to specify attachment points in a fairly arbitrary way, and we now have an editor that lets you in-game adjust those attachment points. What we don't have is anything that actually uses them, right? So what we're trying to do now is go back to that stuff where we had the rudimentary skeletal animation going on, and we need to rethink how that's working a little bit to start to use these points and see where they should more appropriately go, right? We want to figure out kind of where that stuff is supposed to happen. And so what we want to do is we want to have a way of saying, look, when I animate this thing, I animate the base of this guy, like the torso or whatever, and maybe that's attached directly to the world, so I just move that point around. But then the head is like attached to the torso, so any animation that the head has, I really just kind of want to be able to describe it relative to the place where it was attached. I don't want to have to try and animate the head to always appear to be on the body. I want it just to naturally stick on the body wherever it should, and then I can add any secondary motion I want, right? That's the basic idea behind a skeletal animation system is, look, we know these things have to maintain their connectivity. That's, how they would work in the real world. So I just am going to keep them that way all the time by default, and their offset from that is all I'm really going to be animating, right? So that's what we want to start working with, right? We want to start getting that we want that idea to be baked into how we're animating things, which is going to require us to unwind a little bit of what we did and sort of port it to something that's a little bit more about relative movement. But fortunately, we haven't really written much animation code. We just did some basic stuff. So it's not like we have a ton invested in the old way of doing things anyway. It was kind of all sketched out just in a basic way. So that's what we're moving towards. Today, I think we should be able to make a good dent in that, so let's get started. Okay. So running the game so we could take stock of where we're at here. Oops, I guess I accidentally nuked our thing when I did msdevcl on the pre-stream there. Okay, there we go. So, getting started with this, you can see, we've got, right now we're loading the cat as our hero. So what you can see is we're at a point where we've done all the work to import new art assets, such as the cat. We have an editor that would allow us to select the cat, and we can even change like alignment points and stuff like that, right? But what we don't really do is use those alignment points in any way to actually connect things. So a couple things, here are the things I want to do in no particular order today. So we want to snap the cat's head to the cat's body, right? We want it to go up here. So that's going to require set 2 alignment points. One is this alignment point, right, which says where on the cat head we want to snap to, right? And so it's probably something like this point right here. So we want 2 things. 1, we want to do that snap, and 2, we want to see that snapping point. So I want to add something that's when I'm doing this, right, when I'm editing an alignment point, I want to have a notion of the fact that I'm editing it, and I want to draw it so I can see it. Because right now, I don't really know where it is. Like, I've got a vague idea that it's probably in the center of this thing, this rectangle here that we're drawing as a selection box, but I don't really know, right? So I want to draw that point. 2, I need to be able to say when I do this stuff here, so I say, look, that's the default alignment point, but then maybe later when I'm doing this, I add one, right, and I'm going to add in here the base of neck. I want to be able to snap those together. So I want to be able to say, look, the default of this goes to the base of neck. You saw me write the code for that yesterday, so the entities know they're supposed to be doing that. They're just not doing it. So I need the implementation of that snap so that this will snap to here when I actually set it. And then finally, of course, I need there to be some way to draw that. So when I'm moving this around, I need to see that point so I can position it right where it should be in terms of the head attachment, right? So I need all those things. Then we got to do a couple other things. Remember, selecting an entity, it might have multiple parts. It might have multiple components. I want those components listed in the editor so I can pick which one I'm editing, head or body, right, for example. I want that in here, so we got to get that in there. And then finally, we need to start talking about sizes. Right now, like this cat's way too big, right? The cat should occupy like 1 square. It should be fairly tiny on the square. That's something that we want to start working on in terms of how we specify the sizes of things. And that's going to require 2 things. One, it's going to require us to start obeying these relative size information pieces that we put on there. But number 2, it's going to require us to start thinking about how we want to actually specify size to begin with. Because we have, we want that to work in a very broad parametric sense. What do I mean by that? I mean that, let's suppose you are a human, right? And then you are turned into a cat. There's 2 ways we might want to think about that. One is that you become a cat at cat size, and one is that you become a cat at human size, right? Another way to state that would be if a human got a cat head for some reason. The cat head shouldn't be cat head sized, probably. Chances are what you wanted is for the cat head to be human head sized. What that means is that we have 2 notions of scale. We have a notion of scale that says how big the thing is relative to whatever the general scale is. So for example, this bitmap is supposed to be roughly this size for a head. So head shape, how do I fill out how big should this bitmap be scaled to occupy the size of a head? Then there's another scale, which is how big is this entity, which determines how big its head is, regardless of which one of those bitmaps it chooses. If it chooses a human head or a cat head, it should still be the same size. Similarly, if a cat ends up with a human head, that head should be small, like the small cat head would be. So you see there's different things there, right? There's the size of this head relative to other heads, so we know how they all line up to keep all heads to be roughly the same size, no matter how the artist drew them. And then there's how do we actually want to talk about the size of this entity. And we have those two things already in the game, but we have to make sure that now we're rigorous about it. Because any mistake in that line will cause us to lose that ability to mix and match parts, and we'll have this gigantic explosion of special case hacks that are doing things like checking, oh, if I'm a cat head on a human body, then add this actual, right? We don't want any of that. We want that to just work. So it's excellent. We know everything we have to do. We've got a clear test case here. Like, I want my cat to look right when it's hopping around, and obviously it looks completely wrong right now. So we know when we've done the right thing. And so let's just start working on that part of the problem, right? And we'll take each one of those things as we go. Okay, so let's start with something basic. Let's start with being able to see the point that we're editing and pick which one of the things in the list we're going to edit. We know those things have to happen. We just got finished doing the editor. Let's actually go ahead and add some stuff to it while it's still fresh in our mind how it works, so that if we find there are some things that we can't do that we would like to do, that can be improved, right? So what we want to do here is say, look, inside, inside this system, we want to maybe be able to draw our attachment points. Like, we maybe want to be able to draw which attachment points are being used or something like this. And there's a couple different ways we can do that. I think the way that I would like to do it first is just by drawing all attachment points, and then maybe we add the ability to turn them on and off at will. Let's see, again, and remember, one of the things I was ragging on Qt the other day, and here's another good example of why I rag on Qt all the time. It's because I hate those retain mode kind of things. I just want to show how easy it is when you're not doing that to just add things in a trivial way, right? You don't have to retain any information. You don't have to make creation calls or any of this sort of stuff. You can just add stuff freely, and it just becomes very, very easy. I know our UI system is crappy because we spent no time on it, so I know it's not very good, but still, even in its such crappy state, watch how easy it is to do stuff to it without ever having to really change the UI system, and keeping all of the data on our side under our control in the place that we want, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So if I want to, inside my editor, right, let's say I know that we've got these in the file formats. I know that we've got like this notion of these inside each of the bitmaps. I've got this set of alignment points, right? So I know that I've got these HHA alignment points, and here you can see like how many of them there are, right? I've got 12 of these, and so that's how many we were drawing, right? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to draw all of them. I'd like to draw them all in different colors so I can see them quickly, let's say. So I'd like a color table. I don't know if we have a color table. Looks like we do. Maybe. We have a color table, but it's not the world's best color table. Because, as you can see here, it doesn't go up very high. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'd like to get maybe at least 16 colors in here. You know what I'm saying to you? 12, 13, 14, 15. So I'd like to go ahead and make it so that I can draw these in some, different color, right? I'd like to have more of these. And furthermore, I kind of want this color table everywhere. So I'm going to call this, well, actually, you know what it is? It's already, even though it's debug color table, it's already global, and it's not tied to the debug system. So that's fine, right? So what we can see here is we kind of have our full brights here. We've got red, green, blue. Then we've got magenta, cyan, and yellow, cyan, and magenta. We then have sort of the half colors, right? We've got the half colors here for each of our full brights, and we have all the permutations of that. And then when we get down here, we kind of start to run out of colors at this point. So I'm going to have to make up some new ones. Maybe what we can do is some more subtle gradations there. Maybe we can do some colors that look maybe more like this. So If we do that, that gives us a lot more options for how we distribute, because since there's more of these, you know, I can kind of run the clock out there for a while and just say, all right, we've got, you know, that, and then we've also got, oops, maybe I'll do it, keep the order the same there. Got that and that, and then I've got this guy, and that gets me up to 16. Don't know if those are the best color choices. Maybe we can try and pick some better ones later, but you know, there we go. There's our debug color table. So I want to be able to draw these points, and I want to be able to draw, you know, so when I'm rendering one of these elements, I want to be able to show where all the attachment points actually were. And that will help us in the future to like kind of debug what's going on with it. So if I drop into the entity system here and we go down to where these are actually being processed, so inside the piece indexes here, for each piece we can see in here whether or not this is the one that we're trying to highlight, right? And so when we push the volume outline on there, what I can do in that case as well is I can, for each of its alignment points that was set, I could draw that here as a point, right? I could draw a little box in place. So that's what I want to do. So let's do that. Let's get the align point index, and we'll just go through them. We know what the bitmap is. It's in here. And what I should probably do here is maybe make that be something that happens in here, because we don't have these otherwise, right? Oops. And furthermore, if I'm doing two of these, maybe this R equal here, maybe that should just kind of come up here. Oops. So there I've got like a little highlighted option that I check. And that way, you know, as far as the hit test is concerned, I can always just ask that, you know, is it highlighted? And that way we know that if we want to change the rules for how we do highlighting, we just do it in one place. We don't have to do it everywhere in the code. So if we're highlighting, we go through all of these. So here's that bitmap, actually bitmap info, I guess. Oh, and furthermore, I guess this has to go inside here because it's only if we actually succeeded in getting the bitmap. We know that that bitmap info is the thing that has the actual align points on it, right? Remember, that's this thing here. So we want to look at all those align points in order, like so. And as we go through each of those align points, we want to get out what the align point actually was and draw it. Now, we don't want to do that because we can do the get type on that. We don't want to actually get the align point in the case where the align point is set to none. Because remember, everything can have 12 of them. Because we just packed a bunch of data in there. And just, you know, that's how much room we had, so we just used it, right? Everything can have 12 of them. And if you can have 12 of them, it means that a lot of them aren't going to be set. We're never going to have 12. Like, the number of attachment points is probably 2 or 3 for most things. So in that case, you can see we really want to check first. We don't want to be drawing a ton of points that don't mean anything. It just clutters the view. So here in HHA align point AP, I'm just going to grab the one we're talking about in this iteration of the loop. I'm going to ask what type it is. And I'm going to say if that's not none. At the moment, I don't need to know the type any more than that, and maybe in the future we want to be able to stick some information on there or something. But at the moment, we don't want that. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to get the type, and if the alignment point is not none, I'm going to draw it. Right? I'm just going to draw it in there. So in order to do that, I don't know, like our renderer doesn't really have the idea of points per se, I don't think. So, you know, I'm probably going to have to push a cube on there because we don't really have anything else, right? It's not so much that I want to push a cube, it's just that I don't really have anything else. So I'm going to push a cube on there, and I'm just going to push a really small cube on there, right? I'm not going to use any actual texture on it, so I'm just going to take the render group And I'm going to use the white texture on it, so I'm not going to actually put that. And then I'm going to set the color. So we know what the point is going to be, whatever the alignment point should be. So we don't know what that is till we compute it. We do know the radius is going to be something tiny. And then we know the color. Excuse me. We know the color is going to be that sort of debug color table stuff that I was talking about before. So let me see, do we have a get we don't have a get debug color call yet. It would appear. Take a look here. I tell you, these little crackers are good, but they kind of get stuck in my throat. I need to work on my sponsorships. I need like a sponsorship for those little oatmeal cookies. They're super delicious. You know what I'm saying? You got to sign those big deals, those big advertiser deals. Hi, I'm Casey Muratori. When I'm programming, I like to eat, I forget what they are. Nature Valley almond butter biscuits. And sometimes they get stuck in my throat, but don't let that stop you from buying them. Because they're delicious. And when you eventually die from choking, you'll be happy that you choked on whatever they were called. All right, so let's go back in here. You can see us doing the debug color table mod thing here. Not a fan of that. Let's just make that a call. It should be in the first place. So in here we can just say, look, give me a get debug color 4 or get debug color 3. And then you can just pass in whatever you want. And so it will index that for you. And so in this case, what we want to do is say that the result is equal to the debug color table, referenced by the value mod however many there are, right? So that way it'll wrap. If you pass in a value that's too high, you'll just keep getting cycles of those sets of colors. And then if you wanted a version that was bigger, so that it had the 1 implicitly added, so you don't have to do it yourself, you can just call the debug color 4 one, and we'll thunk for you and append the 1, right? Since most people are going to want to do that anyway. We can also go a little bit further and have you pass in what you wanted the alpha value to be, just for maximum convenience. And then we'll set the default value. That way you can even specify the alpha yourself. Look at that service, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I tell you, it doesn't get any better than that. So get debug color 4. We're going to do the render now. I'm going to pass that index in so that it will draw it there. And then I want to make sure that I'm doing that push cube properly. Looks like I've got everything now. I don't need any of those other things there. Should be fine. So now that I got that push cube, that should draw all of those points. And the only thing and it'll tell me, right, or it should tell me somewhere in here is, oops, I forgot that has to go up here now. There we go. The only thing that actually is a problem now is that if you look at the call here, I need to compute this thing, right? I got to compute where this alignment point is relative to the bitmap, and so that's going to be sort of a separate pass that we'll have to do a little bit later. For now, I'll do the basics to try and make it work, but we'll talk about that in a second. We need the alignment point to be get type at set. There we go. Sorry, I just needed that. That doesn't want a pointer. It wants the actual values. So now we're just down to this align P. So I'm going to go ahead and take that align P and try to compute it here. So we need to figure out where this is going to be relative to anything. And you can see us, here we don't really know what we're doing, right? We're passing this in to get bitmap dim and all this other sort of stuff. Fortunately for us, once we have the bitmap dim, we can sort of maybe do a little bit kind of sort of if you're squint at it and don't look too hard. The get bitmap dim call, oops, that's an asset rendering. That get bitmap dim call, you know, all it's doing, it produces those sizes. When it actually goes to fill that out, you can see it creating the dim p here. That sort of lets us know what's supposed to be happening. So if we want to, we can kind of abuse this call. We don't even have to re-implement ourselves. We can abuse that call to generate other point locations. Not necessarily how we want to do it in the end, because like I said, this code is going to get rewritten now that we're doing it as more of a skeletal system. We're going to upgrade that code. But for the time being, right, this will at least keep the computation consistent. So there's that dim p coming through there. That's all we should really need to do. So all we need now is, instead of passing this here, what we want to do is that AP, we want to get the p% of the particular one in question, right? So now we're passing, instead of this one here was just doing a grab the first alignment, we'll use that. This one's saying for each one we wanted, go ahead and actually get it. So now looking that through here, what's the problem? Can't really read this because it's going off the end here. Push cube. While trying to match argument list, render group, render texture, v3. Oh, so what's the problem there? Show me the call. Show me the push cube call. Oh, right. Just need to replicate that value out, since we want, forgot our cubes are not really cubes, they're actually arbitrary boxes. Should probably be called push box, if we're being honest about it. So anyway, what I'm doing now is I'm drawing those points in. Now we can test to see if that's working at all. And it might not be, right? So we'll see. So there's, it's drawing a point, right? And I can add more of these points here and see if they work at all. You know, we're drawing them in. I don't know if those are being drawn in the right place. They're probably not. But there we go. We're actually drawing them. They're probably not because this doesn't include the offset of the entity. So we need probably to go in here when we actually draw it. We're going to have to do this sort of thing, right? So we're actually, yeah, like, in fact, looking at this, I think, so if I'm passing in the entity ground plus the offset plus the piece offset, which again, this is, you can see why we want to simplify this, right? There's way too much stuff going on in there. The dim p gives us what exactly? It gives us that offset minus the alignment stuff. So that actually looks, though, that looks like it should be correct. To be honest with you, right? Because, I mean, look at how this is going to happen. We're going to call this, we're going to take the ground P plus the offset plus the piece offset. Right? So we're actually... That's going to tell you where you would base the bitmap, right? So what you actually need here is these need to be pluses. You know what I'm saying? So it's not quite... So it's really, we want the dim align X and the dim align Y. And so this really doesn't give us the correct values. We could cheat it, though. If you look at what happens here, we just want to go out from there on the alignment. So what we could do is cheese out by just telling it to go the negative, right? So it's like produce the opposite sign when you do your calculation. And that's probably a reasonable trick in this case, I think. Famous last words. So if I go to the point editor now, let me just see where we've got here. if that's actually going to be the right thing. I'm trying to think about which one we're editing to. I don't really know. Well, if that's... we should see that pegged to this. So that still doesn't seem to be the correct thing. I feel like that should have been the correct thing, though. Although it's being drawn... No, I think that should have done it correctly. So what I'm missing something. I'm actually missing something because that should have been okay. Because if we want, if you look at what this is doing here, it's subtracting how much you want to align by. It's subtracting that away. So when you draw it, I guess the thing is you need to take where you were drawing the head and actually put it on there. So I suppose technically the issue there is this piece of information that came back here, right? This piece, dim-p, that is actually the base. So meaning the base is wherever we drew the thing, and then the align point needs to be pegged still to that. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's still correct to use the negative there. It just, we need to account for the alignment that was happening in the previous case. What's that called? Dim-p? Is that what it's called? No. Oh, sorry. It's bitmap dim? Bitmap dim. There we go. So we need to pre-say, okay, offset the bitmap, however you're going to bitmap, draw it there. We then need to base our alignment points thing off of that, because otherwise it won't be pegged to the actual movement of the bitmap. And then we want to go the opposite in, right? I know it's a little mind-bending. That's graphics for you. So hopefully now it's actually correct, in theory, right? And it does appear to be, because there it is underneath it. I would like it to be above. I want it to be raised up a little bit because I don't want it to be occluded so that we can actually see it in this case. So I would like to say, let's also, in this case, move it a little bit towards the camera. So I would like to say, like, maybe move it 1 unit towards where the camera's pointing. We actually do know where the camera's pointing because we have a notion of the camera's axis, right? You can see even in here where we do that, you can see you've got inside the group game transform, we know what direction the camera's pointing. That camera's z-axis is just pointing back towards it. So we can move it closer to the camera so it's a little bit easier to see where that alignment point actually is. So I'm going to go ahead and do that as well. So that should give us a way to draw all of our alignment points, which will let us see what's going on any particular entity here. So if we click on one of these guys, oops, I got to go in editor mode first. If we click on one of these guys and try to edit it, if I look, I should be able to now see alignment points for everybody. Again, why is that not? That should have been closer to me. I'm not sure why we're getting that sort of gross, that offset's not enough. Let me just make sure, let me see what's going on there because I'm not really entirely certain. Let me try moving it much closer to the camera in this case. And we'll see if that works. So there, that works better. Maybe it's a little bit too much, you might say. But in this case, there we go. So if I'm editing the alignment points, let's say I create 2 of them, right? So here's me changing the alignment point on the head. Here's me changing another point on that surface, right? And so, if I wanted the nose, I could place that there. And then now when I'm changing the base alignment point, you can see the nose stays properly pegged to it. So I think that's now letting us edit those pretty cleanly, right? That seems pretty good to me. Now, there's some things I could do here. Again, since it's free for me to move these closer to the camera, I might move them quite a bit closer to the camera in this case, and then just make them smaller. So, what I could do is say, move them 3 units closer to the camera, and just make them very, very tiny. That would allow them to always kind of be floating up near where we were. We could instead try to do something where we render them on a separate path so they don't get depth occluded. I don't really want to go down that route because it just adds a lot of complexity to the renderer that I'm not really sure I want, right? So here we go with that. There's the point. That's maybe a little too small. Let's go ahead and just make that slightly larger. Maybe 2.5, let's say, and make that a little bit bigger there. I don't know if that's actually going to get any bigger. Oh, there it goes. There we are. Maybe a little bigger still. And we'll call that a day. So now we have the ability in the game to create arbitrary attachment points and see them, which is what we needed. So, you know, I should be able to literally go in here and add all of these. The other thing that I'd like to do, because you can kind of see now, you know, if I had all these things, let's say I just had a ton of these points everywhere, right? Now here's the part. So I said I was going to show some stuff that was easy with the UI, and then I proceeded to not actually go do anything related to the UI, really, because this is all just in the renderer. Now's the part I was going to say. So maybe I don't want to render all of these, and maybe I want to see pretty clearly in here what each of those actually, what their colors were. And so what I can do really trivially, just super simple, right? Because again, with, oops, I don't know why I did that. We have an editor open. Again, when you have UI that has a nice immediate mode interface to it, it makes it a lot easier for me to just say, oh, anytime I wanted a button on something, I'll just make that a button. I don't have to create it. I don't have to track it. I don't have to use any types in the UI system at all. I can just say, look, this used to be a label. It's going to be a button now, right? And that's all I would have to do. So in here I can say, okay, you know, I want this to be a button, right? And, you know, I don't have a button F because I didn't write one of those, so I'm just going to create that myself here. Although I could make a button F pretty trivial, I just don't really think it's worth it. Well, maybe it is. Yeah, I mean, maybe it is. Because, you know, if you think about it, it's just that code right there. I mean, why not save people the trouble? It seems reasonable, right? I mean, here's that call for the button. You know what I mean? So, you know, why not do it? I mean, maybe I'm the only person who ever calls it, but yeah, maybe someone else will find it useful. Seems reasonable to me. All right, so what do I need here? I just need dev ID, and I would need to have the enabled flag here. Because I can't pass it as a default parameter since there's just who knows what parameters come in there, but otherwise it's fine, right? I could also make this enabled come back here if I wanted to make it more consistent with it, I suppose, but I'm probably not going to do that. So, all right, let's go ahead and just pass those through. All right. So anyway, let's go ahead and call that button F now, and I will pass the various things in here. I want to create an editor now for this stuff where that button can be clicked on and off. And, you know, I'll be honest, now I think about it, even though I'm glad I made that button F, really this is going to be more of an editable Boolean probably. So it's probably more like this, editable Boolean F. And in this case, right, I want to be able to say, here's my editable Boolean, and I want to edit some Boolean that turns the rendering of these points on and off, right? So, like, I want to be able to say, like, render this on, render this off, do, you know, whatever you want, right? And so, again, it's super simple for me to do this because I can always just make any of these things do that. I don't know whether it's better to do it this way or not. I really couldn't tell you. At this point, I start thinking like, well, maybe, you know, maybe I should just do this format string here because it just seems like it might be getting a little long in the tooth. It's so easy to create these. I'm tempted to just do it, but in this case, maybe it's better to just do it this way so that it's usable by everybody. You know, maybe it's just that, right? So if I wanted to create a button here that you could push, I don't know whether I want to do an editable Boolean or not. I maybe will just use the button because I want to be able to specify my own backdrop color too. So I think what I'll do is I'll just pass it here. I'll just say, all right, if this button gets pushed, then I'm going to toggle whether rendering of that thing's on or off. I'm going to use dev ID from pointer to create a point here, to create an interactor here. The classifier in this case I don't need. The label text I just made. The enabled is always true, pretty much. Well, you know what? That's not true. I could make it so that ones that aren't used are always off. You know, that is one thing I could do. So what I could do is this here could be the enabled. And then the backdrop color, I'm just going to use get debug color for that point index, which is the same thing I used in the renderer to select what the point color was, right? And then all I need now is I need to actually say, well, so I want to be able to click on all the buttons there, and I want something in my editor to track. I just want to know which, for each of those alignment points, I want to know whether they're like on or off, right? So I want like something like draw a line point, you know? I want something like this, and I want that to be set based on how many there are. So, you know, for, let's see here. Where is it? It's not it. So in file formats, I just in here want to be able to say however many there are of these, right? So I want like an array count of these. And unfortunately, it's kind of nasty because you can't, it's sometimes difficult to reach in there and get one of those. So you kind of have to do ridiculous stuff like this to be able to actually access those things. So I'd have to think about how to actually get the array count out of that thing. I might just do this. And then it can just mirror it like that, right? So in here, I'm going to say, look, that's how many of those we're going to have. And then inside the in-game editor, I can just, you know, keep my own list of those. So I can just be like, all right, you know, for each of these, and we'll just set them all to true. So then when we actually go to run this, I'm sorry, when we actually go to compile this, right, the only thing we're really missing here, oh, whoops, that's just format string now. I guess I could call this point name or something. Temp is not a very good name for that. We need a pointer here, and we need to know what we're actually going to be toggling in this case, right? We need to know what the difference, what the render difference was here. And so what I want to do is I want to snap a copy of that. I mean, I want to snap a pointer to that Boolean because this is the thing that I'm editing, right? I'm editing whichever one of these points here, whichever one of those Booleans I'm talking about for this particular point. That's the like point toggle. That's the like draw toggle for this point. So I know that I want to. I know that that's the thing that I want to edit. I probably want to draw the color differently. So if it's enabled, it will draw it in its color. If it's not, it will just draw it as like a generic like dark color or something. I don't know what the color should be, but something like that. And then if you click on it, the draw toggle just gets swapped, right? And so that's really all I need to do. Don't ask me why I left that edit Boolean line in there. It doesn't belong there at all. And so now I just created an array of those things to be editable. And when I go in here to actually edit them, now when we look at that, you can see that it's actually each of those things is available for me to click on, right? And so I just wanted to emphasize, did you see how like really I went in and added a button F because I thought maybe that would be convenient, but we ended up not needing it. So literally, I didn't have to interact with the UI system at all. I didn't have to create anything. I didn't have to store any pointers. I didn't have to set any user data. I didn't have to respond to any events. I didn't do anything. I wrote one little if statement, and I was able to make these match the colors of the things there, control the data I actually wanted to control, which was an array of Booleans that I made and put where I wanted to. I never have to worry about them being out of sync. They're always in sync. They literally cannot be out of sync, right? Every last thing was perfect, and it was 3 or 4 lines of code. In Qt, you'd be inheriting from stuff. You would have had to like go have some custom color thing. You'd be setting things back and forth and connecting events. It's like, show me the thing where that's 3 lines of code in Qt, and then I'll start thinking that those are okay interfaces. Like, they're not, right? This is the entirety of the code that got written. This right there. Technically, it's 1 line of code, right? To do all of that. Anyway. So, 1 line of code. And mind you, it would be 1 line of code if there were an infinite number of buttons. And not figuratively an infinite number of buttons. If there were literally an infinite number of buttons, it would still be 1 line of code, right? Because it would only be calling it for the ones you actually wanted at that given time. Anyway, enough bagging on Qt and other badly designed APIs. So in here, right, when we ask for the button and we toggle it, you can see in here I don't want to ever draw it if it's not set in the first place. So I think I probably want here to, in this, where we're doing the enabled thing, I think I want that to be the other way around, meaning I accidentally set it so that I told it that it was enabled only when it was set to none. What I actually want is I want it enabled when it's not set to none, right? So that was just a mistype on my part. So this is what I actually want. So only ones that are set get the color, and the other ones can't be turned on or off anyway. That way you only see those ones, right, in this case. And that allows me to turn them on and off. I don't know that I'll be doing that much, but at the very least I wanted the colors there, so I figured while I was setting the color, I might as well have made it clickable because it's no more work for me. Because then I can say, oh, I don't want to see these, I'm just looking at just those, or I don't know. Don't ask me why. It's just how I did it. We probably will never click that button, but it can't hurt to have it, right? All right, so now that's done. And what I do need to do now is I need to figure out some way. I've got the rendering in here. That rendering kind of wants, oops, not that. That rendering wants to be set in here to kind of correlate back, right? Like, I don't want to draw this if the drawing is not enabled. You know what I mean? So I need something here that will allow me to access that piece of information. Now, I have the hit test, so that's probably a good place for that. So what I want to do is add into my game editor, I want like a function here that I can call that's like should draw a line point. And it will pass the hit test, and through some crazy set of gyrations, we don't care what it is, if I pass you an alignment point index, you have to tell me if I should be drawing that alignment point index, right? And so in here, I will call that now and say, should draw a line point. And so if it's none, I won't draw it. And if it's turned off, I also, that's another case in which, I won't draw it, right? And so now I just have to figure out a way to actually implement that function, right? Because it's not defined now. And so I need to make a route. I need to make a way to get back from the hit test. I need to be able to do like something like this, right? I need to be able to, So I need to be able to say like the result is false if the AP index is in the array bounds of this thing, right? So I just want to say, look, if I can just give him back whatever that, whatever the alignment point toggle was in this case. So I need to do something like this. The hit test at the moment doesn't get back to the editor, but you know what? It's pretty easy for it to do so, and I don't mind if it does. So the in-game editor here can be there, and then people can ask that question. In the editable hit test, I will have to initialize it, right? If I just ran it now, we'd crash because that hit test would not actually be able to do so. Let me also predefine that. Okay, so if I was to run now, we just crash because that thing's a 0. So as soon as I go to actually ask that question, you can see we get biffed right there, right? So I need to set that when we actually create the editable hit test editable hit test. So inside the begin hit test call, when we create one of these, we need to set it up so that it can always get back to the editor that created it and ask that question. Other than that, I think we're pretty much done. So that gives us the entirety of that particular visualization, like I said, which was the first one that I wanted, the ability to see all the hit test points that were involved, okay? And so now let's just make sure it works. You know, here's all our alignment points as we edit them, and I can turn them on and off in this case, and they work just fine, right? So I think that's all good. We've accomplished what we want to accomplish there, and we don't really have to do anything else, right? That's all, yeah, that all works pretty well. You know, I just realized moving it along the camera Z isn't what I actually meant to do. I meant to move it along the vector between it and the camera. Let me just take this moment. I know this is not what we're supposed to be doing, but let me just take this moment to explain what I'm saying. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to see where on the bitmap these points are. But I didn't want to add a special purpose thing to the renderer to draw them without the depth testing on, right? I didn't want to complicate our renderer to do that, since this is only for the debug tools and the debug editing, right? So what I wanted to do was just move them closer to the camera so they would just sort that way to begin with, right? Now there's two ways I could have done that. I didn't think about the other way because, you know, I just wasn't thinking, I guess. And I also don't know whether that way exists inside PushCube. We have a way of actually biasing our depth coordinate. That's the W. We made our W actually be able to do that. That's probably what I should have done. That's a much easier way of solving this problem. And so maybe I'll go do that. But what I was going to say, I just wanted to illustrate, you can see when I move around, those other points change their location relative to the head. The reason is because of the perspective effect there, right? They're actually hovering up there. And what I kind of brain farted on there was that if you want things to stay in the same place relative to projection, you need to move things along the line from the point in question to the camera position, not along the camera Z, which is actually a line that's just perpendicular to the screen, right? One is actually the line along the projection, and that will keep them in the same place, and the other is a perpendicular line to the screen, which won't. And so I screwed that up. That was wrong. If I want to fix that, the problem is when we go in here, so if I look at PushCube, right, and we look at what's happening in there, the Z bias, it goes into the P parameter here. But we're only able to pass an abstract P there. We're not really able to set a Z bias. That right there is where the Z bias would go. So if we wanted to, we could add the ability to specify that out. Maybe I'll just do that, because why not? And then that solves our problem without me having to actually compute that line, which is trivial to do, but why bother? So here's that Z bias. And I'm going to set that equal to 0 so that most people who push a cube never see it. I'm then going to go ahead and go back into the entity renderer. And then when we're pushing this cube down, I'm going to set that Z bias. So rather than doing this, which moves it, I'm going to use the fact that we have a Z bias, and I'm going to go ahead and set it. And I'm going to set it to something very high. So I essentially want to move it quite a bit closer to the camera, like way, way closer to the camera, right? I don't know offhand, unfortunately. Just trying to think through here. I don't remember what we were passing here. So we need default cube layout. 0 for the emission, 0 for the light source. So it looks like that. So now, hopefully, we can still draw these things. And, you know, I'll be honest, I don't see them, so I guess it did not work. which is unfortunate. So I'm assuming if I set that to 0, it would. Meaning they will get drawn, right? Yeah, there they are. I want to see, so if I set this to 10, though, they presumably don't draw? No, they do. So I guess that 10 is just not enough? Is that all the problem? Is it just that we need more Z bias than 10? Is that all? Well, now they're not. Yeah, now. So I don't know. That doesn't look like it works for some reason. I'm gonna have to go look and see why, because I'm not sure how we compute that Z bias. That's the only thing. So I'm kind of just like blindly setting values and seeing if they work, which is usually not a good plan. But since I wasn't really planning on looking at this particular thing, maybe it does it. And I don't know. Does it go the other way? Like, is it supposed to be more like that? I'm gonna have to go look at the shader. Blindly guessing does not work. So I'm guessing that must bias the Z in a way. Let's look at the shader, because now I just don't know, and now I'm curious. So if we go to the OpenGL shader, what are we actually doing there with that parameter? So if I go to the ZBias shader, which I think is what would be being called here. Oops, OpenGL there. Here's the ZBias program. So you can see the ZBias here. It grabs the W value from that, and then what does it actually do? Creates a modified Z and it sets that. It takes the vertex Z and it just adds the Z bias to the actual Z value. What? Why do we do that? What is the... Okay. So were we just asleep at the switch here? Because look, we load the Z bias out. And then we do the transform. But why wouldn't we be applying that after the transform? Right? I mean, is there really... I mean, okay, so I guess if you really want to think of it that way, it makes some sense to apply it beforehand, because if you're trying to make sure that it only makes things appear to be standing up more tall, then it should only ever work in the Z direction. I mean, that's true. But is that really necessary? I mean, is that the best way to do that? Because, you know, does that actually produce better results than if you just added the Z into the Z, you know, once you actually transform, if you just offset the Z by a certain amount? Either or, looking at that, I don't see why this wasn't working, right? Because if the Z vertex is Z value actually just gets added directly like that, it should just work after the transform, right? Like, I don't see where the problem comes in here. Because after you do the GL position and you take the modified Z, where you've transformed both things, and then you take the modified Z for use with the depth buffer, that should have just worked. And I don't know why it wouldn't have. I guess one reason is maybe we got too far, so it clipped itself off. I mean, that could be. Meaning, if that was the case, then you just needed this to be something else. It just needed to be a different value that is actually within those bounds. I don't know. We can try it, but I don't think that's it. So that's interesting. There you see it working just fine, right? But not in this mode. So not once the camera is locked. But I have no idea why. It must be because of the way we're computing the Z depth or something. I mean, look at that. That actually works great. But go like that, and suddenly it's broken. And even if I get to almost exactly the same position, I mean, that's very close, right? I mean, that's almost imperceptibly close. That's super close. So something about the Z bias, do we like turn off Z bias or something when we're in that camera mode? Like, what's going on there, right? It could be because of the Z range. So one difference is, in the, if we look at what happens in the renderer, I believe the Z ranges are different in those two cases, I guess. In here we've got a bunch of settings for like ranges of things. And the near clip plane, far clip plane, I guess are things that are actually getting set there. You can see the near clip and far clip can get passed in here. So if I actually go to world mode and look at what those are, you can see that if we're in debug camera mode, the far clip plane is like set to a drastically different value in that case. And the near clip plane is too. So in debug camera mode, so I guess what's happening is in debug camera mode, the near clip plane is set in. So you can see it set at 3. So if the camera was like 8 above, wow. So basically this is getting clipped by that clip plane. So it's like it has to be less than 5 because 5 is exactly where it would have been clipped. Oh my lord. That is a mind bender, but okay. So it was getting clipped off the near clip plane because the near clip plane's actually pretty far out in the game camera. Wow, folks, graphics. Always too complicated for its own good. So in this case, you can see now that it stays pegged pretty well, right? And it will drift a little because remember the head itself is tilted a little, so you can never get it quite exactly right. I could myself account for the tilt, and if I wanted to do that, it would be pretty straightforward. It's just we have to first take the next step that we were going to take out here in order to do it. And that is, you can see here we create X and Y axes that are actually bent from what the ones in the world are. And so as we pull those out here, which is exactly what I wanted to do for the actual usage of these points, that's what the piece transform part here was going to be about. As we move those out, we'll be able to really peg it exactly. So that's just a better thing all around because that will allow us to have perfect pegging in a second here after we do that part of it. But before I do that, and we may have to wait to next stream for that because I got other stuff I got to do right now. What I do want to do is just get back to the editor side of things. There's one more thing we need, and that is that when we pick something in the asset editor, remember I pick this, I've got this problem, I go to asset editor, I pick it. What's going on here? Which one am I editing? Am I editing the head? Am I editing the body? I can switch to the alignment point editor, but I can't control which one of those two things I'm editing. That's not what I want. I want instead to be able to pick out of the assets which one of those I've got. How do we do that? We need to add a secondary thing that allows us to look at some of the things that were clicked on and pick them separately. So one of the things we didn't do in our UI is have a bitmap picker. It should be pretty easy actually for us to add exactly such a thing to our UI system because it's pretty flexible. So if I just go ahead and add that in, it will allow us to do a pick probably pretty easily. So let's say I go into our editor. I can probably add the picking pretty trivially. Honestly, I can probably do something where it actually is what's the word I'm looking for? It's probably pretty easy to actually add this editor without seeing the bitmaps, so I could just add a little nubs to pick them. I'll do that first, and then after we have that working properly, I'll go in and add a widget that actually just shows the bitmap itself because that's easier for us to use and shouldn't be actually very hard to edit because, like I said, if you make a good UI API to begin with, it's pretty easy to just tack stuff onto it. So let's go ahead and do that. Inside the asset editor, what we have here is editing an active asset. What we want to be able to do is switch which active asset we're actually editing. And so the way we can do that is back out here inside update and render, we've got this notion of like, undo and redo, right? So, in here where we're actually editing this thing, so I'm in the editor and I pick this, we kind of just have this understanding right here of what's going on. We don't have any narrowing, any selection stuff. Let's add some selection stuff, okay? So what I'm going to do here is say, let's add some stuff here. Let's make a row for this. Let's have something that shows the selection, all the things in the selection. And so the way I can do that is just do a for I loop over what I already sort of set up to do this, which is inside the in-game editor, we have this notion of an active group. What's an active group? Well, an active group is a thing that has almost exactly what I wanted. It's got a number of assets in it, and I can loop through which ones they are, right? That's exactly what I wanted. So in here, what I can do is say, okay, let's go through each of those. So for the editable asset group, I can just say, what's the asset index? It's actually an asset index if you think about it, right? Because we're actually indexing into a list of asset indices. So it's an asset index for each of the ones in there. Actually, it's not an array count. It's for that active group, editor active group. Active group. There it is. Asset count. For each of those that we have in our pick, I can draw something that lets me sub-select out of those whichever one I wanted, right? So what I can do there is say, well, for each of those, if they push a button that's whatever, I don't know, it's going to be a bitmap button at some point, probably, right? If I pick this bitmap button, then I switch to that asset, right? That's all we're talking about here. So I've got an editable asset in each of these cases. So all I want to do here is say this is the editable asset. If I go to this active group and pick out one of the assets, so there's the asset index. When I get that editable asset out, what I can do is say, look, here's the button. It's going to be this asset index and this asset ID. Those are actually the things that are going to get picked here. And what I can do is, we already know what that looks like. So inside editor interact, we already had a thing that was going to do that. So in here, you did those picks and whatever. I don't remember exactly how we did it. It's here, right? Yeah, so you can see it here. Let's just pull that out. Let's make these be something a little bit more specific there. So like this whole thing probably should come out, and we'll look at how that's going to go in a second. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, instead of doing what we were doing before, I'm going to say editor active group equals editor hot group. So when you pick an asset, we're actually going to do this, and then we're going to do inside there is set the asset index to whatever the first one was, right? So I'm going to do like I guess I can still do this now that I think about it. All I want to do here is just make this a little bit more systemic. So I'm going to say, look, this is the one. It's this one, right? That's the one you should use. And so then I'm just going to pull this out here, and maybe I'll even do this. So essentially, you can, to clear it, you just pass 0, right? So then I've got a thing here. This is going to be set active asset. It's going to take the in-game editor, and it's going to take the asset you actually wanted me to select. Like that makes sense. And then so in here we would just say, look, if you pass me a valid one, I'm going to use it. But if you didn't, I'm just going to clear it. Make sense? So then we just have this is now something that's a utility function. So I can make that happen wherever it wants to. So in here, if someone was going to select something, I can just say set active asset, and I can say this is the asset to select. So now all I need is a way of actually drawing the various assets. I don't really have a way of doing that right now. I'm just going to draw a blank thing instead, and that way I can switch between them just as a test, and then we'll make the bitmap thing that actually lets us, do that specific selection. So now, when we go into the button code, I just have to actually, let's see here, there we go. I just have to actually pass the rest of the stuff. I need a dev ID here. I can do that probably by just using the actual dev ID of the asset itself, I'm guessing. I don't think there's any reason why I couldn't do that. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I'll have to think about that a little bit later. The classifier in this case could, I don't know, just be, the edit asset. There we go, because that's unique in this case. And so then we've got label text and enabled. There's the label text. The enabling is always going to be true. The background color can stay as it is. And then we need to change this to be a bitmap in the future. And so we're going to work on that in a second here. So I think that's everything we would need to be able to sub-pick assets inside there. And so now, when we select one of these, we should have a thing that shows how many assets were under the cursor there, and be able to actually pick between them. So we should be able to select different assets in this case. You can even see, like, if we look, there was another asset that was picked. It probably isn't is that really an asset? That's probably just a room, which doesn't probably have anything in it, right? But you can see now when I pick, so let's say I picked down that line, right? So like the pick was like right there. I need to make it so it doesn't actually repick on camera. That's probably something I should do. But you can see when we picked down that line, you can see now I can select everything that was down that line just by doing this, right? Which is pretty awesome. You know what I mean? So now anything that's under the cursor all the way down like 16 deep, we will, is it 16? I don't really remember how many it was. Don't want to say the wrong thing. Don't want to say the wrong thing. 8. So 8 deep down, we can, get, hey, probably that's the answer right there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So everything down there we can now pick outside of the UI in a little convenient little picker. That's exactly what we want in that case, because that allows us to really cleanly pick between these. The thing that's not so clean about it is we can't tell who we're talking about. That's why I say let's go ahead and add something that actually shows a little tiny little bitmap. It doesn't have to be big, just a little bitmap in there that we can then use as the differentiator, okay? So in order to do that, what we need is some way of actually looking up what the bitmap is. Fortunately, we have an asset index in this case, so we should be able to actually look it up in the same way we were looking it up here. So we should be able to do something that looks essentially like this outside in the selector, and then we just do it for all of the things that were under there instead of only the active one, just in this one case. So we go ahead and get the assets. We see if those assets are bitmaps, and if they are, we can display them here. And we can use the actual bitmap itself as the way of displaying what's going on, right? So we know we've got a get bitmap call that we can use to actually get the bitmap after the fact. And then we'll actually do that here. So bitmap loaded bitmap equals get bitmap, right? Assets bitmap index, which is whatever the asset index is. So I think that's all there is to it. And so when we now come in here like that, I just need to pass this bitmap in. And along with that, a notion of the size, so like how tall the bitmap should be. I don't know how tall it should be. Let's just say we're going to draw it in a 64 by 64 square. So I'm just going to say that's the width and the height of what I want the actual blocks to be. And so I'm going to be able to say bitmap button. This is some blah, 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 blah that's going to happen here. And then I've got some things like highlight or active. It should always be active. The highlight should only be true if this is the active asset. And I know that that's true because I can look to see whether this is the one that's being edited at any given time by saying, well, if the edit assets asset index equals the editor's, active asset index, then I know that this should be highlighted, right? Does that make sense? So, you know, something like this. That should be everything that I need for the UI system to have it. So now I just need to actually implement that in the actual bitmap system itself as we go. Now, I don't actually necessarily in this case need to actually load the bitmap. So I could make it so that that passes, instead of a bitmap pointer, it could just pass the bitmap ID, right? I don't really know which one of those it should be. If I look at what happens in the code here, I could probably simplify this quite a bit if I just didn't have to do that, right? So another way of looking at it would be to say, well, maybe it would just be nice if we could do this. You know? Because that simplifies the code there a lot, and then that goes into the bitmap button code, which is better because that code can then, you know, be shared across anyone who wants to pop up a bitmap for a button for some reason. So that seems a little bit better on the whole. So I'm going to go ahead and make the extraordinary claim that that's what should happen. I realize that maybe I'm a little far afield there. But okay, so if we do bitmap button and then I do dev UI layout here, and we want all the same stuff basically. So it's, you know, it's the same code in terms of what's going on, but instead of the char label text there, I'm just going to do a bitmap ID. Okay. We then need to know the width and the height. Oops, that actually came first. And then we need like enabled and highlighted. So there's our code for bitmap button. Substantively speaking, we want to do this, right? So we want to do basically the same stuff here, but this part has to change rather dramatically. So it's only like the very preamble part that's really going to be what we're using here. And so we need to kind of rewrite this part to work with a bitmap, right? So if I go up and look at what goes on in here, just looking at what we've got. Yeah, like, you know, we're going to have to do basically this stuff, and it's going to have to change pretty dramatically. So we want that as our basic idea of what's going on in the code, but it's got to be modified quite a bit. So we'll start by saying, okay, let's get started here. In terms of looking at the UI itself, we really just need the assets pointer here. So it's really the render group that we care about, not so much the UI. You can see what's going on here. We're not really using that UI as much. Well, we kind of are. So we'll keep that out. But we really want this. We want the render group to be out here. So that's coming out here. We don't have a text bounds. We know what the rectangle is because we've been told what the rectangle is. So we know that we've got a rectangle min-max, essentially, that looks something like this. You know what I'm saying there? So we know we've got something like this. And then we've got this dimension stuff here, which could be sort of written off the same thing as well, right? So we can do that, but if you look at what it actually needs in this case, the height part, so it's really the dim could really be expressed, I guess, more succinctly this way, right? So that gets our dim. That's how much space we're going to take out. We ask for that, and we get back how big it should be. This all probably works just fine. We've got the backdrop color here that we wouldn't have because there really wouldn't be a backdrop color per se. So this is probably a non thing because we probably want to do a rect outline of this thing when it's selected and then just nothing when it's not, I guess. I don't know. That's hard to say. Maybe what we really should do is just pass one in here and then have that lighted up or not. That I really just don't know. But either or, once we actually get here, what we want to do is we want to do a push bitmap call to actually draw this thing. So let's just start with that, and then we'll play around with the rendering a little bit later on. So maybe like we just don't do this yet, and we say like, yeah, not gonna happen. So in here we'll do the push bitmap. Let me look inside the renderer for how we want to do that. Where is our drawing? Is it push upright and push sprite? So it looks like we more or less want this, right? That will give us, this will give us what we're looking for in terms of a quad that's constructed. It's not necessarily exactly how we might have wanted its construction to be, but it's good enough. So here we need to get that renderer texture. So we need that to have been queued up. So we'll have to do that here. So that's something we'll have to do. The center P is pretty easy. It's going to be whatever the element bounds, the center of the elements bounds are. So it's really just going to be this. And we know that we don't care so much about our Z location here. I guess it's the UI text transform is where it should be roughly because it's on the text layer. So I believe it's that is what we would want our Z value to be. You know what I mean? The size is just the elements bounds. The color is going to be, well, all the rest of this stuff is the same. So we don't really need to worry about any of the rest of that. I think that's just all there is. I think. The min UV, max UV we could pull out. We could, if we wanted to, we could actually use the width and height to pull that out into the min UV, max UV. I'm going to leave it this way for now because I actually think it would be nice to be able to see how much of the texture our stuff is occupying. You know, unfortunately, sometimes it's not very much. And so I'm going to leave that for now, but we could change that later. All right, so the next thing we have to do is actually implement that, that sort of ability to get the bitmap out. So that's really just going to be this. We're just going to try and get that bitmap ID. If we get it, we're going to call push sprite, and we're going to go ahead and pass the bitmap texture handle. Is it texture handle? I think it's texture handle. And then if we can't, we're going to ask the asset ID to load it. We're not going to set the missing bounds because this is an editor. It shouldn't ever cause a delay in rendering. The border in this case, I'm not sure that we know what that is because normally that gets passed in as layout thickness. So I guess in this case, I'm just going to say it's always the layout thickness. You can't really change it. Maybe we should allow you to change it, but in this case, I'm not going to. If we pull this code out into a separate pass, then we would. The item interaction here is just the interaction we specified. Go. The group in this case is the render group. v2 v3.z. Is that all? Was there another one? Push sprite rectangle 2 to v2. So in this case, it wants that. All right. So we'll see. In theory, that should have given us something. I may have messed something up there, but that should give us the ability to have bitmap buttons. Maybe, hopefully, possibly, who knows. Hey, look, it worked really well. So there's all of our sprites. The problem is, like I said, we're just doing 0 to 1, so we're just seeing whatever the texture had in it in its entirety, which may not really be the best thing to show there, but you know, for the moment, it's fine with me. And so those are all the things, you know, that are poked behind the cursor. So if I actually go here and again drill down on that line, you can see like each of those is all the same, right? Like there you go, because each of those is one of the same kind of tiles. You know what I mean? And so if I pick something that's more kind of goes through a couple different things, then you can kind of see, okay, so there was a floor, there was the cat, there was the old torso on the guy, there was the another floor tile, there was the cat tile, there's the wall that was picked through there. So now what I really need to do is I need to find some way in here of I want to find some way in there of picking like drawing making it clear whether it's selectable, and if it's selectable, was it selected? You know what I mean? So I want in there to have something like when you select this thing, you know, if it's highlighted, then we push a rect outline on there, I guess, that does something, and I don't know what that something is, but like, you know, it's just I don't know. Maybe you can set that color, probably, I'm guessing. But, you know, something like that. So, you know, when you're in here, I want to be able to see that. I can't really see it, probably because it's not thick enough. I would also like that to be afterwards, so it has preference. So that's going to be, what are our transforms inside DevUI? I don't actually even remember, to be honest with you. There's a couple different sorting layers that we were using to keep things out. So we've got the text transform, shadow transform, UI transform, backing transform, tooltip transform. I'm not sure which of those really we want. I guess I'll say UI transform. What are those set to? So I guess I might want this to be text transform and this to be UI transform. I don't know. So we'll just make that do what it does, and we'll see what has to happen afterwards. All right, so how do I set a thickness? Anyone know? There we go. So I want this to be a reasonably thick selector. Maybe that. Seems pretty good, right? So now I can set like, okay, you know, I want, why does that go away? What is this? I wonder, what is this? Something, oh, that's the room. So I wonder if I should double check. Maybe I should still ask if the asset is a bitmap when I point it out here. Because maybe we do want to just look if there's not a, well, maybe not. I don't know what we want to do. All right, don't know. So I'm going to go ahead and say, look, let's see if this works. Suppose I want to edit the alignment points on these two things. So the cat, right? So I can pick the cat here, and I can just say, you know, here's the alignment of the cat in general, right? And, you know, maybe I just want that to be whatever that is. I don't know what it wants to be. But then I can add another alignment point there and say, look, that's the base of the neck. It's going to be like right there, right? And now that's set up properly. I flip back to here. I say that's the default alignment on this thing. And so that makes it pretty easy for me to edit. Like, I mean, that was trivial, and that's great. So, and then I can go back and save it when we implement the save feature or whatever, right? So that seems pretty good. And so now those things just have to actually get used. We're at the 5-minute warning now, so I guess I'll leave it there for today. That's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with where we got on that. And we'll go from there. Can I do Q&A? No, I can't. So I've got to do, what we've learned is I have to do Q&A in #hero only, right? There it goes. All right, any questions on that? Does anyone have any questions on that, on what we just did? Questions, concerns? Does anyone have them? Does anybody have them? Oh, I like that feature. That's kind of fun. You can see what the top of the scope was by mousing over. That's nice. Don't know that I'd ever use it. How come the near clip plane is set at 5 and not closer? It's not set at 5, it's set at 3. But the reason it's set closer is because we wanted to eliminate things that were in front of the upper floors and stuff. So that's just what we had picked because of how we decided to construct things. You know what I mean? So that our alpha fading clips that out there. If that makes sense. Would we be showing linkages between alignment points? There are no linkages between alignment points at the moment, if that makes sense. Are you saying... I'm sorry, I don't know what you're saying. Are you saying you want to draw just the entity? I'm not sure. Let me say a couple things about that, and maybe it answers your question, maybe it doesn't. Our art assets do not have the concept of linkages between alignment points. They just have alignment points. Entities specify, when they're created, which alignment points they want to use to line themselves up, but it's per entity. So every entity can be constructed differently if it wants to be. So there is no way to edit that. It's intentionally in the procedural generation side of things. So we don't need to draw the linkages between alignment points because you can't edit that. That's strictly in the game. The only thing that the art asset is allowed to specify is if someone wanted to use a particular type of alignment point, which one would it be, right? So that's why we're not drawing that. Does that make sense? What would you say is crappy in your current implementation about the IM GUI? A lot of stuff is crappy about it, right? Because we wanted to minimize the amount of time that we spent implementing the actual back end, right? We just wanted something simple there. And so it's got a lot of hacky stuff in it, right? It was just whatever is the fastest is what's in there, you know? So if you were actually trying, like, you know, let's say you're trying to compete with Qt, right? And you want to make an IM GUI that's supposed to do that, you need to spend a lot more time on like your widget rendering and how the layout works. Like you need to put a lot more code in there, right? Because a lot of that stuff has nothing to do with the user interface. That's just, it's just polished, right? And so all of that work would have to be done. And it's not done, and ours is crappy, right? It doesn't look very nice, you know? And so you need a lot of that to be done, if that makes sense. You know, your visual design and typography. Exactly the things I was complaining about on the pre-stream about how CSS is terrible. All of the stuff that CSS sucks at, we need to do the good version of that to make a nice, beautifully laid out, properly aligned fonts, nice edging, nice anti-aliasing, like all that stuff. That's all real work that has to be done. Now, granted, Qt doesn't do most of that either. Qt looks like crap most of the time too. But if you were actually wanting to make a really good GUI system, whether it's IM or not, that's a lot of work that has to go into there. There's a lot of graphical polish that has to go in there. Would it be useful to add mouse wrapping like in Blender so you can drag past the end of the screen when editing values? Sure, if this was like, again, that's exactly what I mean by polished. That if you were trying to make a very polished editor, sure, you would do that. We probably wouldn't spend time on that because it's not really super necessary. Okay, not seeing any more questions, so maybe we can wrap things up early. Isn't it an overhead when checking for if button when doing that every frame? Well, so two things about that. First of all, no, not really. And the reason for that is because if you're drawing something, then it's usually comparatively free to check the boundary of its rectangle, which is all the if button does. So in terms of overhead, it is an overhead that literally can't really show up on your profile. Now, the larger question, which is, isn't it an overhead to have to redraw the entire frame every time? Yes. But that's not a restriction of IM GUI. You can easily just call IM GUI once and just save the results into a bitmap and only call it again when the user actually tries to click on it, right? If that's what you want. Now, granted, if you do that, then you can't make UIs that respond to mouse moves in complex ways, which is one of the powers of IMGUI. So I usually advocate just draw the whole thing every frame when someone's actually interacting with it, because then you can be much more responsive and everything can change as the user moves it around, which is nicer. So I prefer that, but if you just are, maybe you're just concerned in minimizing the amount of battery usage or something like that, then you can trivially just not call the UI to be redrawn or edited or anything until they actually click the button, right? Will you ever make an emote or just steal one of John's? So you'll have to forgive me. I don't know what that means. Am I allowed to make new emotes? Is that something I can do? And if so, how do I do it? You'll just forgive me. I don't know what that is. I stream on Twitch, but I'm not much of a Twitch streamer, if that makes any sense. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for the 12-month sub, and so on. But I literally don't know where that is. Like, I'm looking now, and I have no idea where. Is there a thing for that on the dashboard or something? What's the reason the UI loses state when you hot load? So the reason for that is it doesn't always, right? But sometimes it does. And the answer to that is, one of the ways that you make creating the UI easier on the user is by letting them use things like transient pointers to identify things. So for example, if you look at where we set things up when we're using the UI, you can see inside dev-id from pointer, you can see where we're passing transient pointers sometimes, right? Do you see that, how that's happening? Those transient pointers are only valid in the code as it was loaded originally. When we do hot code reloading, some of those things may get reallocated or moved around, like string pointers, for example, and now they don't refer to the same thing anymore. So the UI system, when it goes, oh, he hasn't selected that thing anymore, it's like he selected some different thing or whatever, right? That's where the state gets lost. Does that make sense? And so you could make it so that it preserved the state, but I don't really want that because I don't care that much about preserving the state during hot load of the editor. So I don't want to force the people using, and by that I mean me, but the user of the editor, I want them to still be able to just use pointers because it's just more convenient for them to do. It means they don't have to introduce IDs and stuff that they don't want. Can you play around with it a little more? I mean, I'm happy to do so, but I think I did all the things that we could do. By the way, we really need to, these two guys not snapping to the corners is really driving me nuts. I got to fix that one of these days. I'm happy to play around with it a little bit more. I just don't know what it actually is that you would want me to do. I mean, here, let's add some points. We can move them around, I guess, in here somewhere. And then in here what I could do, right, is, oops, I moved that to the wrong place. We have undo, so I can undo it, right? I can even undo the creation of those things. Right? So that all works real well. So we have undo and redo, which is good. I can pick some of these other things, and you notice selection isn't an undo or redo, so that's properly separated out between the two. I can add some more in here. I don't know. So I mean, yeah, I can play with it, but I don't have much. I don't really have any. It doesn't do. anything other than what you already saw me program it to do. So with software rendering, you can do hot regions that are redrawn when the user fiddles with UI elements. Can anything similar be done with hardware rendering? Yes, certainly. So what you need to do if you want to have hot regions that are redrawn only when the user fiddles with UI elements, and you've already seen me implement the code necessary to do this actually inside the renderer, so we've already done stuff like this, is you just create. So remember, even in Handmade as it currently stands right now, we don't render directly to the back buffer. We render to intermediate buffers, which then get composed to make the back buffer. So if what you wanted to do was eliminate redraw on the UI, and so you would only redraw when the user fiddles with UI elements, what you would do is create one more back buffer. That back buffer would hold the UI, and every time you draw UI, you draw it into the back buffer for the UI. Then that gets composed onto the game, right? And you've already seen me do all those things. All those things we already did inside the renderer. So you can go back and watch me do those. We did them. So we just add one more back buffer, that's the UI state. And then what we do is we never clear that buffer, right? So we just draw the UI into it and we leave it as it is. And then whenever we want to redraw a piece of the UI, we clear just the rectangle that occupies that part of the UI, and then we redraw with a scissor region just set to that. We just redraw that part. So it's very, very simple, actually. Will the finished game soup with almond milk? No. Sadowski, you get Anna to draw something cute like a cat, and then you upload the kitty image to Twitch. Well, yeah, but where? Is there somewhere? I guess I can just search online for how do I upload emotes. You know what? Here, I'll just send an email, and you know I'll try to figure that out. Let's see. So here's an email. I will add Anna and myself, and we will try to figure that out. But yeah, I mean, so the reason I have not done that is because I literally just don't know anything about it. So I'll go search for like, how do I upload whatever, and we'll go from there. Let me see if I have any more questions. A page on the Twitch dashboard, huh? All right, I don't know where it is. Maybe it's under like clips or collections or something. I don't know. I'll find it. I'm sure there's a tutorial. I'll just search for the tutorial. I'm sure there's a tutorial somewhere. Is it costly to re-update the image to the GPU? So I think this is a question on, so it says, what is the best way to add to an atlas map? Is it costly to re-update the image on the GPU? The answer is no, it's usually not costly. And the way that you do it is in OpenGL, you use text subimage to update just that subimage. We're doing almost exactly the same thing, just with a texture array. So instead of calling text subimage 3D, you would call text subimage 2D. Make sense? So that's really all there is to it. What do you think about a tree-based undo system where you do not lose the redo state when changing after undo, but create branches? I think they're cool, but the interface to an artist can be pretty confusing. So you have to, the thing I would encourage there is to think about how are you going to expose it in a way that the artist won't get really confused about what you're showing them, right? Because remember, an artist isn't a programmer. They don't know about things like tree-based change representation, right? They just look at what the app shows them and they learn to use that. And so you have to present it in a way that they're going to like go, oh, I get it, right? And you certainly could do that by showing like a timeline that has branches on it or something. But then you have to ask yourself also, is it worth it? Like, is the value that they're getting out of having that extra UI that's kind of onerous and overbearing, is it worth it, right? And maybe the answer is yes, maybe the answer is no. Just something to think about. So, thoughts on ML? Will your game use it? ML, the programming language? Maybe you mean machine learning. I guess what I would say is, regardless of whether you mean ML, the programming language, or machine learning, the concept, the answer is still no, the game won't use it. So I guess I can answer the question even without knowing what the question is. You said you wouldn't use the internet at work. I'd like to do that, but I'm missing MSDN on the GL document and the GL documentation. What do you do when you don't have this information locally available? Asking because I prefer not to have the internet around when coding. Two things you can do. Number one, for GL documentation, you can download the spec, which is what I do, from opengl.org or the Chronos. You can just download the spec and then just use that PDF offline. And that works pretty well. So that's one way to go. The other thing for MSDN is you can try to get offline MSDN. It's hard, but you can try it. I would say, look, just bite the bullet, do your research on MSDN online, and just bite the bullet, the fact that you have to use MSDN a few days, keep that programming isolated, and then go back to having no internet after you're done. I really wish you could get MSDN offline. Unfortunately, you can't anymore. But what can I say? One Bit Brain, you talked about threading being hard to say. Would you use OpenMP if that's... No, so when I say threading is hard, what I mean is that architecturally speaking, threading is very difficult. And it's very difficult because C++ doesn't really support what you need. OpenMP probably doesn't either. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at it. But what I'm talking about is things like if you have a large number of threads working on something. Let's take a very simple case. So let's suppose that all of my game is running. And then the user decides in the settings menu that they're going to switch from OpenGL backend to Direct3D backend, right? Every thread that was currently working on something graphics related is now some kind of wrong. You know what I'm saying? Anything that was working on an asynchronous transfer is wrong. Anything that was waiting on the results of a compute operation is wrong. There's a lot of wrong going on. And those all have to be shut down, and their memory has to be properly reclaimed, and their resources have to be properly freed, and all of those things, right? And new things have to be started up that all properly use the new Direct3D version of everything, right? These kinds of waves through the code base are very hard to model and hard to make efficient, in my experience. And I just don't see a lot of people solving those problems. They usually do one of two things. Either they solve a problem that I really just don't have, which is how do I get a bunch of threads to all cooperatively work on a math problem? It's like, that's like day 2 of multi-threaded programming. Like, it's not an issue. So things like OpenMP, I'm guessing, don't really have much to offer me because the problem they're solving is a problem I don't actually have, right? Or they solve the problem the C++ way of now every last little thing does 10 times more work than it has to do. So it's like everybody is like creating tons of allocation, free, release, open, lock, like tons of just interrelated, disastrous lockup on every little thing, whether it's opening a file, allocating a little bit of memory, doing this, doing that, right? And so the right answer is something that correctly looks at these waves and can break them apart for you and can automatically do the aggregate frees and releases that you need, and we're nowhere close to having that kind of correct analysis, you know? So like job management just isn't a problem. Like that's not a problem I have. Job management is trivial. So if the primary thing you're offering me by getting your system is job management, I don't care. Right? Like that's not the hard part. You know, talk to me when you do really good aggregate memory management that's super efficient. And doesn't do stuff like have to walk trees or check things, like that's actually just really kind of knows like, okay, I can set these 1 or 2 points where I know after all these things correctly finished, I can do 1 block free, and when these things need to start up, I can do 1 block allocate, and I properly have them laid out, and like when it actually does all that stuff, okay. But until I see some evidence that that's going on, I'm skeptical. Maybe OpenMP has it. I haven't looked at OpenMP. Maybe it's awesome. I doubt it, but you know, maybe it is. All right, I think we're all done. Thank you everyone for joining me for the episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along with the series at home, you can always pre-order the game at handmadehero.org. It comes with the source code so that you can play with it yourself. Until next time, have fun programming you'll see on the internet. It probably will not be next weekend. It will be much sooner because we are still celebrating Krampusslauf. Hopefully I said that right. Krampusslauf. For the next couple of weeks, which means there will be lots of surprise streams probably all throughout the week. So I will see you back here probably sooner rather than later. But until that surprise occurs, have fun programming, everyone. I'll see you on the internet. I don't know if John's streaming today, but I set up the Handmade Hero Twitch to automatically host John if he is. So if he is, it should switch right over to him. If he's not, well, I guess we don't get to see that today, but hopefully we do. All right, I'm going to sign off. Thanks for coming, everybody. See everyone next time.